What is happening behind the scenes in Detroit right now is not normal, and it is not business as usual for this franchise. This is one of those moments where you can feel that the organization has shifted gears, where the decisions being made are heavier, bolder, and clearly driven by a sense of urgency to win. This is not about tweaking around the edges anymore. This is about reshaping the identity of the Detroit Lions offense in a way that could impact everything. From how games are called on Sundays to how division rivals prepare to face this team, the hiring of Drew Petting as the new offensive coordinator is at the center of all of this, and it cannot be treated as just another coaching move. This is a gamble that demands results, and more than that, it demands structural changes to the roster. Analysts Corey Woods and Ben Raven made it very clear that this is not a safe or conservative hire. Petting comes from 3 seasons running the Arizona Cardinals offense, and during that time he built something very specific, something that stood out across the entire NFL. His system leaned heavily on formations with big, tall, physical players, using size and strength as a weapon rather than an accessory. No team in the league used those types of heavy formations more than Arizona during that stretch, and the production was not just theoretical. Until the end of November last season, those formations averaged 5 yards per play, which is elite efficiency in this league. For Lions fans, this should immediately sound familiar. Dan Campbell has never been afraid of lining up with a third tight end or even an extra offensive lineman. Physical football has always been part of the vision in Detroit. The issue now is not philosophy, it is personnel. This version of the offense requires bodies, and the current roster has some alarming holes. The interior offensive line is a major concern. Taylor Decker is already considering retirement. Dan Skipper has already retired. That reality turns this from a long-term discussion into an immediate problem. It is no longer about whether the Lions will have to rebuild strength in the trenches, but how aggressively they will do it. When you talk about Petting's system, you also have to talk about tight ends, because they are absolutely vital to how his offense functions. This is where Sam Laporta becomes a central figure in the conversation. If this offense works the way it is designed to, Laporta could be one of the biggest beneficiaries, if not the biggest. Just look at what Trey McBride became in Arizona under Petting. The role is there, the usage is there, and the production can follow. But there is a serious red flag that cannot be ignored. Laporta is recovering from back surgery, and while both he and the team hope he will be ready to return to practice, there is no certainty yet that uncertainty matters. Because when Laporta and Brock Wright were out during the final stretch of the 2025 season, the Lions' offense took a noticeable hit. It became predictable, easier to defend, and far less powerful in the middle of the field. Woods and Raven were blunt in their assessment. If Detroit wants this offense to function the way Petting intends in 2026, investing heavily in the offensive line and reinforcing the tight end position is not optional. It is mandatory. Raven summed up the Petting hire with 2 clear messages. First, the offensive line is going to receive serious investment. Second, the tight end room is going to be reinforced. That is Detroit telling the rest of the league exactly who they want to be again. A team that punches you in the mouth in the trenches and forces you to match their physicality? But a plan on paper does not win games without the right players, and that is where this conversation becomes even more emotional for fans. One of the biggest uncertainties surrounding the Lions right now is David Montgomery. His frustration during the 2025 season was evident both on the field and off it. After the season ended, General Manager Brad Holmes openly admitted that trading Montgomery is a possibility, even though he also said he would like to keep him. That honesty alone tells you how fluid this situation really is. Here is where Petting's presence changes the dynamic. He loves this type of running back. Watching how he used James Conner in Arizona, it is impossible not to see the similarities with Montgomery. Conner is not a speed back. He wins with patience, balance, and the ability to read blocks before exploding through the right lane at the right moment. That is exactly what Montgomery does best. Jahmyr Gibbs, on the other hand, is pure explosiveness. He is chaos in space, instant acceleration, and open field electricity. Montgomery is the counterpunch, the steady pressure that softens defenses. Petting never had a player like Gibbs in Arizona, and the idea of building an offense that combines those 2 styles, strength and speed, hammer and scalpel, is incredibly compelling. This is why it makes sense for Petting to sit down with Montgomery and show him exactly how he fits into this system, how his skill set could be maximized rather than marginalized. But there is also a contingency plan. If Montgomery does leave, James Conner is set to be a free agent this offseason, and a reunion with Petting in Detroit would be a seamless fit. The system would already be familiar, and the role would be clearly defined. All of this is happening while the Lions are already fully focused on the offseason, even as the playoffs continue. Owner Sheila Hamp addressed this reality directly, acknowledging how difficult it is for fans, but emphasizing the need for composure and long-term vision. Detroit needs to recapture the identity that once made teams fear lining up against them. The core of the roster is still strong. The draft remains the backbone of this team, with multiple players earning All-Pro recognition in 2025 and elite talent developed internally, but before the 2026 draft even arrives, free agency and internal evaluations will play a massive role in determining whether this offensive transformation can actually succeed. This is only the beginning of the story, and every decision from the offensive line to the backfield will shape what the Detroit Lions become next. Based on everything laid out so far, do you believe this new offensive direction is the right path forward for the Lions? Or does it come with too much risk for a team with championship expectations? The next layer of this story takes us deeper into the offseason chessboard, because once you accept that Drew Petting's hiring is not cosmetic, every single roster decision starts to look different. This is where Detroit's margin for error shrinks dramatically. The Lions are not rebuilding anymore. They are recalibrating, and that is a far more dangerous phase for any franchise. One wrong assumption, one misread on personnel, and an entire season can tilt the wrong way. The center position is a perfect example of this pressure. The Lions know this offense cannot function if the middle of the line is unstable. There is no hiding a weak center in a system that relies on timing, leverage, and power between the tackles. The most coveted name on the market is Tyler Linderbaum from Baltimore, but everyone inside the building understands that this is more fantasy than reality. The salary math simply does not work. If the Ravens had exercised his fifth-year option, Linderbaum would have been set to earn over $23 million in 2026, which would make him the highest-paid center in the league. That alone tells you how unrealistic that pursuit is, regardless of interest. So the focus turns inward, and that brings Tate Ratledge into the spotlight. Brad Holmes revealed that Ratledge did not look overwhelmed when he took snaps at center early in training camp. That is not a throwaway comment. That is a signal. The Lions now have to decide with absolute conviction whether Ratledge can be trusted as the long-term answer. This decision cannot drag on. The offense cannot stumble out of the gate for a second straight year because of uncertainty in the middle of the line. If Ratledge is the plan, then Detroit can pivot toward adding a veteran center for depth or taking a developmental prospect in the draft, especially now that Kingsley Eguakun is with the Browns. But that choice has to be made early, decisively, and without hesitation. This urgency ties directly back to Petting. His offense demands cohesion up front. The heavy formations, the pre-snap movement, the disguised intentions, all of it collapses if the offensive line is not synchronized. That is why this hire is not about creativity for creativity's sake. It is about structure. It is about building an offense that knows exactly who it is and forces defenses to react. When Detroit talks about returning to its essence, this is what they mean. Not flashy slogans, not viral clips, but a team that dictates terms physically and mentally.
And this is also why the backfield conversation refuses to go away. The Montgomery situation is not just about personality or cap space. It is about philosophical alignment. In Petting's system, the running game is not a complement. It is a foundation. Montgomery fits that mold almost too perfectly. His patience, his vision, his ability to press the line and explode when the lane appears, these are not replaceable traits. Gibbs gives you lightning. Montgomery gives you control. Together, they give you balance, and balance is what makes an offense resilient when things go wrong. But the Lions have to be honest with themselves. If Montgomery's dissatisfaction lingers, if his role cannot be clearly defined and communicated, then even the best schematic fit will not matter. That is why this offseason is as much about conversations as it is about contracts. Petting has to sell the vision. Brad Holmes has to align the cap. Dan Campbell has to reinforce the identity in the locker room. Every piece has to move in the same direction, or the entire structure starts to wobble. Zooming out, this is why Sheila Hamp's message carried so much weight. The Lions are at a crossroads where patience and aggression have to coexist. The core of this roster was built through the draft, and that remains the lifeblood of the organization. Gibbs, Laporta, Jameson Williams, Kirby Joseph, Brian Branch, these are not accidents. These are the results of a clear philosophy executed over multiple years. But development alone is no longer enough. The margins at the top of the NFC are too thin. Detroit now has to supplement, refine, and sometimes make uncomfortable decisions to stay in that tier. The signing of Drew Petting is not the end of the story. It is the opening chapter of an offseason that will define whether the Lions are truly ready to take the next step or whether they are still searching for the final pieces of their identity. Everything from the offensive line rebuild to the future of the running back room feeds into one central question. Can Detroit impose its will again, week after week, against the best teams in the league? Another critical angle that cannot be ignored is how this offensive shift changes the pressure on the defense, because identity is never isolated to one side of the ball. When Detroit commits to heavier personnel, longer drives, and a more controlled pace, it directly affects how the defense is deployed, rested, and ultimately evaluated. Time of possession stops being a stat and becomes a weapon. Fewer snaps for the defense means fresher legs late in games, more aggressive play calling on third down, and less exposure for depth players who are still developing. This is part of the hidden value of Petting's philosophy, and it is something the Lions have chased for years without fully locking it in. This also reframes how rivals in the NFC North have to think about Detroit. You are not just preparing for speed on the perimeter or explosive plays in space. You are preparing for sustained physical punishment, long drives that lean on the interior line, tight ends sealing the edge, backs pressing the hole over and over again. That kind of football wears teams down mentally as much as physically. It forces defenses to rotate heavier bodies onto the field, which then creates matchups for players like Gibbs and Jameson Williams when the moment is right. That balance is exactly what makes an offense hard to solve over 4 quarters. But none of this works if the Lions hesitate. This offseason is about clarity. The coaching staff has to be aligned on roles. The front office has to be decisive with resources. The players have to understand exactly what is expected of them within this structure. There is no room for half measures anymore. The window is open, but windows do not stay open forever in the NFL. Every season that passes without a clear step forward tightens the margins. That is why this moment feels heavier than most. The Lions are no longer chasing respect. They have it. Now they are chasing consistency at the highest level. The Petting hire, the offensive line decisions, the Montgomery question, the tight end depth, the center plan, all of it feeds into one defining objective: becoming a team that knows who it is, embraces it fully, and forces everyone else to deal with it. The next few months will tell us whether Detroit truly commits to this identity or blinks when the hard choices arrive. If this vision holds, the Lions will not just be competitive, they will be imposing. And that is the difference between a good team and a team that is remembered. What makes this stretch even more fascinating is how thin the line is between confidence and overreach. Detroit believes in its foundation, and rightly so, but belief has to be matched with execution. The league is full of teams that had the right idea at the wrong time with the right philosophy with the wrong supporting cast. That is why evaluation becomes ruthless at this stage. Sentiment cannot outweigh fit. Reputation cannot outweigh function. Every roster spot, especially on offense, has to answer a simple question: does this player help us impose our style, or does he force us to compromise it? This is where training camp and early preseason reps will quietly decide more than any press conference ever could. How quickly the offensive line communicates. How naturally the heavy packages transition into play action looks. How comfortable the quarterback is operating with tighter windows created by condensed formations. None of this shows up in headlines, but all of it determines whether this offense feels natural or forced. The Lions cannot afford for this to feel experimental once the season starts. The margin for patience is gone. There's also a psychological component to all of this that fans should not overlook. When a team fully commits to an identity,